Hello, everyone. This is another session in our OData News series where we get to start talking about the projection service. In the last session, we had a little discussion around, adjusting the tokens that are coming in from the tokenization service and basically more heavily kind of, adjusting it and identifying it a little bit further. Ideally, in real time, what we want to do basically is that we're trying to kind of break down the process, as far as we can to make sure that we're sticking to this concept of single responsibility. Everything that we're saying and doing here is subject to change. This is a very much so rewritable software. This is where we are. We have a raw query coming in here. So it's a raw query coming from the outside world, and then this raw query gets turned into a tokens, bunch of tokens. And then these tokens will turn into more projected tokens. So this is the projected tokens. And then ideally, at the end of the day, these tokens will turn into what we call nodes, right? So these are nodes, or O nodes rather, O nodes, right? And these nodes is what can be translated into, expressions. They can be translated into interesting be translated back into queries, whatever the case may be. Ideally, in your space. Sorry, Joe, I was just kind of walking people through, through the recording where we're starting and where we're ending. So from your customer to your customer, basically, whatever that customer may be. It could start with the storage and the provider, and all the way down to the consumer. There will be a very interesting situation where we basically need to kind of think about a duplex two-way street, like you're going back into, tokenization, back into O nodes, back into projected tokens, and then back again into raw query. I don't know what that's going to look like yet. This is just a very high level. But what do you think, Joe? That looks about right, right? Raw query tokens, projected tokens, and then O nodes, and then, whatever else, expressions, strings, other queries, whatever you want them to be, they will be, right? And there will be a situation where you want to go the other way around because on the client side, so this is why was I saying talking about this duplex two-way street is because there is a time where you want to go and say, okay, here's my controller, here is my service, and here's my broker, right? And this broker is basically talking to another OData enabled service or multiple OData enabled services, right? So this is OData enabled service or API, right? And what I want to do is that at the API controller level or whatever that exposure layer may be, I want to go and say this query that's coming here as $ filter name equal Joe, like this. I want this to come from the outside the exact same way without me having to let that protocol leak into my inner business logic. So this guy will go in here and will get translated into an iQueryable, something like that. And then this iQueryable will get passed down to the broker in here, and it will come out of the broker back as a query, back again as a raw query that will get transcended to other services and all that. There's some magic to that. This is almost every single real life enterprise level customer would ask for exactly this mindset, when it's coming to the transcendence. This is what I call transcendence. You're basically transcending the query through your services. And now you could have multiple microservices like these, and it'll just work fine. It'll just function just as expected. The beautiful part about this is that you can go here and say, wait a second, I want to break down this iQueryable into multiple queries, and I want to be able to send these queries in 3 different dimensions, 3 different directions, right? However people want to implement that. What do you think about that? Are we on the same page on this one? Does this look like a clear plan? What do you think? So that's the duplex. That's me sending in an expression on an iQueryable and bringing it from the other side as a query. So it's a two-way street, right? It's this way, and then we're also going to go the other way. which is going to be very interesting because, you know, in order for us, this goes back to what I think it was Paul who said, effect of, hey, we want to make sure that we leave traces that would allow us to revert the token back into its original state, right? And that's why we're keeping the actual value in our tokens. That's really, really important because if we can't do that, then there will be no way back, and this whole project wouldn't actually fulfill its true purpose. Now, I remember before moving forward with any of this, I remember you talking a little bit about if the projection service should return new type OData token. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that? Go ahead.
So one of your goals and visions for this is, say someone wants to make an extension point that gives a new keyword to OData, like compute or max or well, max and min are
Fuzzy
part of
search,
OData.
whatever it may be.
Yeah. So, and this could be the first extension point into that, and that's defining a particular type of token.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, After this, then you get into like token type handlers or something. Like when you get an OData parameter, you have to inspect it, see if you have a handler for that or a processor for that, and then
Mm-hmm.
from there on, we basically have most of that implementation at least queryable at this point, so we can, like, if we get a string in and it's got a word in there we don't know what to do with yet, we can now use this service to say, hey, after we've projected, if there's anything left over that we don't know about, a word or a separator, those are the
Mm-hmm.
generic ones, we can throw or do whatever. We can hand it off to something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this seems to be the first extension point, I think,
I
where,
agree. I
yeah.
think that's okay because at this point in time, so maybe the projection service is not agnostic. It's OData aware.
Or
And
X.
is there anything that we can salvage as an agnostic processing before we start doing OData specific things?
Um, I mean, at this point, the what my understanding of this particular section of the service is, it's going to look at this collection of O tokens, and it may change the type. It may take a few of those O tokens and combine them. Maybe one O token cancels out another, so it can decide to ignore certain things. So this is our first real area where we can branch into different ways of handling things.
So you want to. So let me ask you this. Would you entertain the idea of, and this is not discrediting any of that. I think this is perfect. I think this direction is perfect. And my question here is, should we not worry about dollar sign things yet until
I
we get.
wouldn't. I would just. I would the dollar sign or any special character we use for identification purposes, unless we need to do something with it now, we can ignore. Like if we get a new thing that's like um, dollar sign, and then what that does is combine the next two tokens or some crazy rule like that, we can do that here. But I would push it down the pipe. Let something more specialized handle it.
Okay, I'm totally okay with that. Then let me ask you this. Then still we still have to map word and separator into things, right? And these things can be, forgive me here, Joe, if skipped a couple of thoughts, but uh, we still want to say, like, you still also can't say EQ is an operator. Somehow you still have to call it something else because it's OData specific, right?
Well, it depends. I mean, EQ could be, uh, well, yeah, I guess most of the things that I would use for that example would be O database. But if you wanted to use this to process another set of keywords, EQ could mean something different right now.
And I think, let's see. I think here's the things that this can be mapped to. right? We consider the word is either going to turn into
Keyword
literal,
was one of the things we came up with.
keyword, right?
Yep.
Literal. Um, let's see. There's no HTML, sorry, there's no URL specific things that we can, um,
No, the only thing the URL gets us is a key value pair for
that's
query
it.
strings. Yeah.
So what if we made this projection service kind of give us like a single quote something then single quote again? That's universally a literal. It's not OData specific, is it?
It depends on the context you're receiving it in. If you're receiving it in a URL, we could do it that way. If for some reason you're processing a JavaScript or JSON file to do this, quote and double quote might mean something similar. This would be the service that would reclassify that stuff.
Okay, we could keep the idea of word and then say maybe there's a new type called literal, which is a separator plus a word plus another separator of a specific type.
In our current implementation, the quotes are part of the word.
Oh, really? We already
Yeah.
make,
Yeah, I
okay,
went back and checked it during our last stream.
okay
The only
then.
thing that's splitting on is equals, space, maybe ampersand, and a couple other like actual URL separator characters. We chose to include the quotes as part of the word.
In that case, then, a word can either turn into literal or just another word because it's identifiable operation, like a dollar sign filter. We don't know what it is at the projection level. What do you think about that?
Well, have we decided that the service is allowed to take on dependencies? Our last one didn't.
This
If
one
we could
won't
take on a
either.
collection of
So
type providers or something like that, they can. So we're going to have something that inspects this collection, right? Those inspectors can choose to provide a new token type.
until we come up with the lake house, because you were building a library, things, hey Paul, things could come in a until we build the lake house, it might look something just like this. You have an orchestration service, and this orchestration service basically picks up three different services. It basically passes in the query, the raw query to your tokenization service. The tokenization service responds. It sends it down to the sorry, this is tokenization service, and this will be the projection service, and this will be your OData service. And these guys, basically what this guy is doing is that it's receiving a raw query from here. And this raw query is coming into, since this is OData, this will be OData orchestration service. And this service will basically go and say, go ahead. None of these have any dependencies. They are what I call a dead end, service. It's self-fulfilling service. It doesn't have any logical dependencies. It has infrastructure and framework and technology dependencies, but that's just a different type of categories of dependencies that we may or may not have control over. So if you're sending a raw query in here, you're expected to get from the other side. This OData orchestration service will basically do two things. You give it raw OData query, and it will give it back to you as an expression or whatever you want it to be. Or you give it an expression and it will turn it back into a raw query, right? What that basically means that this OData service, sorry, O nodes, and then you can take these O nodes and do whatever you want with it, turn it into an expression, turn it into whatever. This component in and of itself, that's a product, right? Because you're basically going here and saying, give me that raw nonsense, and I will turn it into something that you can convert it into whatever you want, right? And we could entertain that idea for a bit and see how far it goes. Ideally, whatever comes out of this orchestration service, something else will be sitting in here, right? That will go and say, take that expression. Maybe this is expression service. This will be SQL service, SQL expression service. This will be Lambda expression service. And this will be, say, something like whatchamacallit,
GraphQL.
graph, could be GraphQL service, right? And what this guy is doing, this guy is OData expression orchestration service. And what this guy is going to be doing is basically going to go and say, okay, something is going to be sitting all the way up here, and this thing is going to send the raw query in here and receive O nodes, and then take these O nodes and send them down here. And based on the parameter that's passed in, it's going to propagate what do you want this to look like, right? Do you want it to be an expression, a SQL query, whatever the case may be? What's the beauty of this is that we can make this extension based. Like you can go and say, I want to add a new extension for whatever. This way you're still honoring the structure of the standard until we do the lake house, because this has to happen, because I don't want to, in scenarios like these, in terms of extensibility, I don't want to keep building a pyramid. Despite the fact that I have Egyptian heritage, I don't want to keep building pyramids like these, right? I want to be able to go and say, no, this is why I love the cul-de-sac vertical so much, because you're 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 extending, but in the other direction, right? That's the beauty of it, right? Um, this
So is the lake house, in your opinion, that's going to end up building out like cul-de-sac at scale, right? Where you tip something in, something subscribes to an event effectively, and then it gets tipped
whatever
in.
you call it, yeah,
Boom,
whatever
boom,
you
boom.
call an event, think
Yeah.
about the lake house as the substrate that's sitting in here. And these services are just talking to each other through that substrate, right? Like they will be going like this, back and forth from here to here and here to here, right?
Yeah.
Um, we really should, I don't know what that's look like time-wise, but we really should kick off that effort individually away from OData, because that's not OData. Lakehouse is not OData specific. It just so happens that I want to try it with OData, right? But it certainly applies to everything. Someone yesterday on YouTube went completely like, he was like, this approach is slowing down. Let me show you. So really a long time ago, I published a video about object-oriented messaging. And object-oriented messaging is just this early thoughts. You know how thoughts form in our heads, and then we come back to it and say, wait a second, there's an opportunity, where we can actually entertain that thought again. Someone sent that message yesterday, literally in here. This is a video that I created back in 2020, some 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, right? And it talks exactly about the lake house, the exact same ideas. See, ideas keep going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I was trying to use a thing that showed up with the .NET 5 called something that we stole from Golang, which is the channels, right? So if you look in there was a published article. Let's see here if I can. Did I show the published article, or did I take credit for someone else's work? Hold on. There it is. Yeah, there it is. Right. So this was published back in 2020, early 2020, where I think Richard Lander, he basically talked about channels and stuff like that. I even had a couple of friends try it in the real life project while I'm just sitting there in the corner, just waiting for it to blow up. And I was like, hey, how did it go? And they actually made it work, right? So channels may or may not play. How many of you have played with channels yet? Do you guys play with channels yet? It's very interesting. Let me show you real quick. It's like a pub sub for free. You don't have to worry about. Let me go back here and just show you this real quick.
Is it just another take on service bus?
It's like, in a way, yeah. It's basically, so if you do a channel like this, it's an IO native model that you can. There it is, channels. Here's my channel. Check this out. This is gonna blow your mind. You need to give it some kind of type. So I'm just gonna go here and say maybe a string. Okay, and then in my channel, I can go here and say channel dot create bounded or unbounded. So you're creating, let me zoom in a little bit just for people on their phones. Here, create bounded channel, right? And you get to pass into this channel. What are the options? I want my messages to be strings. You guys gonna love this a lot. And then in here, you're gonna go and say bounded channel options. And in these options, you get to do some things. I want the capacity not to exceed 10 messages, like internal queue in your system for free, right? And then outside of this channel, you get to subscribe. You get to actually add people and say writer, right? And then write message. and you're sending a message in that queue, and whoever is listening to that message from the other side will be notified asynchronously. So I
This
can
is
go
all
here,
in process.
huh?
This is all in process. There's no service boundaries or anything being crossed.
Nothing. It's all within the process itself.
Can it
Ideally,
can it be
this might be.
backboned like Signal R?
Yeah, you just create a listener that funnels it out across a wire.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
The only downfall of this, like trying it in real life projects, is that it can be quite mind bending to think about the amount of, like, if you're sending multiple asynchronous messages concurrently and they have any dependence, you have to be really, really good in parallel programming class. You have to be really, really good at that.
Yeah, so I hit similar issues with the stuff that I've been doing on that reverse factoring project that we talked
Mm-hmm.
about.
Mm-hmm.
So I've gotten to the point where I'm event chaining sort of 3 or 4 orchestration services down the chain, and I'm like, okay, what's subscribing to what at this point? And just keeping track of the sheer number of services and who's doing what is problematic without having some diagram to fall back on and
Yep.
knowing on that diagram what I have and haven't implemented. And it gets particularly tricky when, like, you make an API call and there's supposed to be this string of events that takes place after it, and
Mm-hmm.
some of them have and some of them haven't. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, trying to track all of that down, I think, is probably one of the, well, I mean, you said yourself in our discussion, this is not day one of programming. This is definitely an advanced
This is
topic.
advanced
So,
programming. I'm done doing kiddie
yeah,
stuff. If you go back to 2007, you will see me was still talking to people about binary search and all that nonsense, right? And then I had a purpose. I discovered that I have a purpose, and my purpose is to talk about the things. And by the way, the reason why not a lot of people talk about enterprise software development, it's because it's so boring. Like, if you're to some people it's boring, right? Like, here's the problem. If you're going to talk about enterprise software development, you're not going to have a lot of followers on the internet. And if that means
it's
something
funny
to
though.
you, huh?
It's funny though, because like everybody wants to build this amazing product that
Mm-hmm.
scales, but the
Mm-hmm.
only time you ever talk about scalability is in enterprise.
Yep.
And yeah, as soon as you start mentioning enterprise concepts, yeah, people just switch off. It's just
People
like,
automatically be like, oh, can we just keep things simple? I know that. I saw that look. Dude, I used to stand up in front of a whole bunch of engineers and start talking about enterprise things, and I can see the look. Like, a big part about you presenting anything to people is to be able to read the room. And I can literally see a guy playing Sudoku on their phone, right? So
sounds about
so
right.
they're already checked out. The only reason I thought to myself, the only reason I can bring people to talk about enterprise and still be excited about it is to make it simple. Stupid simple. But here it is. If you don't understand the foundations and the standards and all that, now Paul, you and I and Joe will be in this place where people are like, what are you guys doing? What event? How does this even work? Right? I remember when I first a guy from Russia, his name is Igor Novatsky, he showed me events back in 2004 in C sharp, and I looked at him like he invented fire. I was like, what? How did this method just light up out of the blue like that? But he was using, do you guys remember COM objects? Do you remember that
Yeah.
nonsense, COM
Oh
objects?
god.
He
Yeah.
was sending it out of the application into what we call today a queue, right? And then it's coming back into the application. Somehow he subscribed to that event, right?
Was he
And
was he using the Windows message queue?
yes,
Yeah. I had a
MSFW.
guy
Yeah.
that did that, and I looked and I'm like, why'd you do that? Like,
so in this day and age in cloud native world, we would look at this and be like, what kind of nonsense is that? Why are you doing that? But anyway, let me just roll back real quick to what Paul was saying. There's a lot of emphasis on low level architecture, right? If you don't have a map, you won't figure out. So you have one of two options. Either you build really, really small components that do one thing and do it really, really well, or you write all your brain in one file, right? And deal with the complexity of testing. It's a trade-off. I choose to heavily rely on creating 50 files This is why you will never find one nested if statements in any project that went to production that I wrote. Why is that? Because I'm spreading out like horizontally. I'm spreading out like this. The decision that service B is doing, there's another decision that service A is actually handling. If you mush them together, you end up with nested if statements.
Yeah, somebody who I have a lot of respect for once said to me, don't scale up, always
Mm-hmm.
scale out. So if
Mm-hmm.
you can scale horizontally, you will be able to scale indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another key aspect to this as well, is like in programming, there are three areas that are basically considered black magic. And whenever you talk about enterprise software, two of them are in there. So one of them is threading, second one is networking, and the third one is GPU and scalability and in GPU processing effectively.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody comes out with a way to allow me to write C# code and farm that out to my GPU, I will give them anything for it. Literally. I mean, that is pure black magic. I mean, have you ever seen what high level shader code looks like? It's brutal.
You should
But
you should see the folks that design microprocessors
yeah,
at the hardware level. The dude, I was watching this show yesterday, and the guy was literally saying, because the room got a little bit colder, it couldn't retain the binary values on the chip. It
yeah,
started
that'd be
giving
good,
us weird,
right?
yeah, it started giving us weird readings. What were you saying, Paul? What did you say?
Surely it would be good. Like the cooler the room is, the better the chip would function.
It's at this point, you're not dealing with code, you're dealing with physics, like you're interfacing with nature,
Yeah,
right?
Real engineering.
That's real in like well, Alan McKay says that. He said people who take their software seriously build their own hardware. Hence
yeah.
where I am in my life right now and what I'm building, hardware. Hardware, software, right? I
It's
changed my
funny.
title. I'm not a software engineering manager anymore. I'm an engineering manager. There's something behind that. There's a
Yeah,
reason for that because it's not software anymore. But anyway, what I'm trying to say is the I think we have something going on here, but we're gonna need to. I'm really passionate and invested in the lake house, you guys. I promise you, it's groundbreaking. Like if it actually happens the way I expect it to, dependency injection would look like a thing from the past. The way we look at COBOL and Fortran when people talk about dependency injection. Alan McKay says, object-oriented programming is meant to be having multiple objects. They don't know anything about each other, but they're sending messages. Paul, let me ask you something. If I sent a letter, an actual physical letter to your house,
hmm
right? I don't have to know much about you to send you a message. All I have to know is just your address.
yeah. I mean, that's the key to interfaces, right? The address is the
Yes,
interface.
but
You're saying
interface is
this.
still too much. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, but what you're basically saying is that over here it's Royal Mail, but the worldwide mail system has said, look, we've got this interface. It's called a post box, and we've got this rule around it. It's part of the contract, right?
The
You,
address
you
and the
put
name and yeah,
you
go
put
ahead.
special things in the post box, and they pop out anywhere in the world.
Yep.
I mean, it's that simple, right? And this is what we're trying to build in software terms. But for some reason, that holy grail of doing just that has proven to be this most like elusive thing that I would say like 95% of programmers just can't get their head around it. And the 5% that can, companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Facebook they're just snapping them up because they're like, yeah, we need you to like run the world. I mean, look at the
Yep.
stuff Netflix is doing. When
Yep.
they do a thing on cloud computing, everybody sits up and listens
Yep.
because they're solving a problem nobody else can solve.
But also you have to know like there's a lack of content. Like on the internet, everyone is still teaching, how to mock an object, right?
Yeah,
And I understand that. I understand that you have to also know that a lot of the content on the internet is someone who's learning out loud.
yeah,
Learning out loud. They're learning something and they're, sharing that, right? Um, these kind of topics are the boring topics that I try to make a little bit fun. It's not that simple, but you have to follow through. Like I was just asking my friend Kailu this yesterday. Sorry, 2 days ago. I was telling him, are we too far in our ivory tower that we've lost touch with reality, with the ground? Right? He said, well, if you're writing the standard and there's someone out there that is willing to read the standard, they'll get to the point where they actually understand what you're talking about. Right? How do I know that? Interns. You know how people really don't care about interns? Interns actually are the only way any senior software engineer out there would know whether they are detached from reality or not. Because you will
Yeah.
sit down with someone who's just right out of the box, green. They just came out, right? Maybe a little excited about Uncle Bob and some of these, materials, and then you'll start telling them things like, oh, there are brokers and services and exposers, and we need to define our software this way, and how they react to it. That is the actual measure of whether your standardization efforts are intuitive enough or not. Now, back to this topic here. Just assume we'll find time for the lake house. It's not a deal breaker, but I already announced it, so I have to make it, right? And I'm actually excited about it, right? But Joe, back to your question, does this structure make sense? We tokenize, we project, and then we turn it into O nodes. And then we spit O nodes from the O data server. So let me just for the sake of order, we tokenize in here, right, Paul? And then you basically project, and then you turn it into an OData specific. What we were talking about, Paul, before you joined in, is that this projection service, does it still need to be agnostic or not? Right?
Yeah, that was the sort of question that I was raising last time when we sort of finished. I didn't know if we had enough from the tokenization service that we could project directly into O nodes with some level of extra intelligence, maybe at a convention level or something added into the OData service that you've got there, or whether
Mm-hmm.
or not we needed the projection service in the middle. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's probably a case of we don't need it, but following your mantra of breaking things down to the absolute simplest form they can be in, it might add something, and I think it would simplify the next stage. So usually, Hassan, your gut feeling is right, so I tend to go with it. I found that in my own code as well. Everybody knows I'm implementing the standard myself, and when I generally come back to you and ask questions because I'm not sure, it's the obvious way to solve a problem is to look at that and go, well, if I'm struggling to understand what the issue is, break
It's
that
not
down
simple
into
enough.
two or three,
Yeah. Yeah.
2 or 3 other parts, right? Then
Yeah.
look at those. If I've still got the same problem, recurse until
Someone
you don't have a problem.
someone asked me this on Thursday. They said, "Hey, acceptance tests sometimes fail." I said, "Well, they're telling you something, right?
Yeah,
The,
so
the
I've
problem
hit
is not the acceptance test. The system that you built is flaky." Go
I
ahead, Joe.
weirdly I've hit the same problem. I've got a couple of acceptance tests that sometimes they pass and sometimes they fail. And I looked at the test and I was like, well, I can't see anything wrong with that test. So there's clearly something wrong with my system. And I've been smashing my head against it for several days now. But I've just been like, well, the code has to be wrong, right?
You
It
also
has to
have
be.
you have to know that you're like, I am very patiently waiting for you to come back and say, okay, here is what I learned. Remember when you first said, I want to implement the standard in my
Yeah.
real life? Just for the guys watching, uh, Paul is using the standard in his real job, like for a living, trying to actually make his world better. And I really hope that you're watching this, whoever you are, wherever you are. We're almost 7,000 people, so at least one of them, will actually look and say, why don't I make my world better? Because a lot of people will say, oh, if it works, don't fix it. That I am the number one opposer. If you say that, know that I hate you to your core. If you say if it works, don't fix it. That's some MBA graduate who doesn't give two rats asses about what the software actually, how the software works.
It doesn't work though. There isn't a single piece of software out there that's completely bug-free, is the
Right.
perfect implementation, and cannot be improved in any way. And any developer that tells me I wrote a line of code 6 months ago and I think it's perfect and I'm never going to change it is talking out their ass.
They're lying.
Yeah, because they've either not learned anything,
Which
or
is
they
a
just
death
don't give
mark.
a
Yeah.
shit. Yeah, so it's one or the other, right? I mean, to my mind, like if I go back and look at my own personal projects and I look at code that I wrote last month, I often sit there and go, what the hell was I thinking? You know, and I've been a programmer for 20 years. So, you know, if you're getting like grads that are saying that, uni grads, then they have no idea what's coming.
Anyway, so I agree. You know, back to this. I was just telling Joe just before you joined, Paul, the whatever is coming back from, so at the token level, you know, it's coming in as word, and we're translating it into something more specific, like either a literal or back to word, because we don't know about a $sign filter. Not just yet. This is at
Yeah,
the
so is
prediction.
this the wrapping things in single quotes, that kind of convention thing? Because
Yes,
my
and
thinking is that that's an OData thing, right? It's not a general thing. Although Sam did say
oh,
that
it's
a
not.
literal is a literal, right? It's a
I'm
literal in
very
any
sure it's
language.
not OData specific.
So no, it's just a notation of how that data is being represented in whatever medium, right? If you have a string of characters, how do you represent a shorter string inside of it? You have to have a character to identify that the things between these two things is like data.
No, it was more specific than that for me. I kind of looked at, so let's say I had the word Sam wrapped in single quotes, right? In C#, that would not be interpreted as a literal. That wouldn't even be valid, right? But if I wrapped it in double quotes, that would be classed as a string. So I could say, okay, yeah, that is a literal. You know, but in JavaScript, for example, single or double quotes is just as valid. So what I'm saying is there's some context there that depends on the parser for implementation. So my thinking is if it's a valid OData literal, then that is OData has chosen to interpret as such. It could also be a valid JavaScript literal, but it's not necessarily a valid C# literal. So depending on what's processing it, do you see what I mean? You would get different results. So what I didn't want to do is say, hey, this thing's not an OData thing. It's a more generalized thing. And then have us imply some OData knowledge on it in some way, because that would just cause us, you know, further down the line. It's going to cause us headaches when you try and unpack that and use that for non-OData things in some way. So I didn't know what the right answer was, to be honest. And at the time, it was like everybody was saying, no, it's the other way. It's definitely, you know, a literal is just a literal, whether it's wrapped in single or double quotes. It doesn't make any difference. It's still a literal. And I was just like, okay, but C#'s my bread and butter.
Let's call it a literal. I'm okay with that, you know. And then other than that, the separators is where the work is going to be, because we basically want to go and say, you know, whatever you call a separator, it needs to be either an open parens, you know, closing, you know, parens, or something like a I don't know, you know,
Space.
what did we call the equal sign? Just equal sign?
Just
The equal
equals,
sign.
yeah. It's
So
just the equals character, right?
operand, is that what we call it? Operand?
I think we just called it equals.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, we did. So operands were for like EQ and LT, GT, that kind of thing, because they were OData operands.
I'm okay with that. Is that gonna be confusing down the road when you translate EQ to something else?
Well, EQ would translate to an operand token type, right? Whereas equals would translate to an equals. It's a very specific thing, right?
There will also be bigger than, lesser than, all these kind of things, right? So this is where the work is gonna be. We basically want to go and say, translate all these separators, and then for the words, it's either a literal or something that is protocol specific that some other service is going to be handling. How do you guys feel about that? And again, just because we're making a decision now doesn't mean that we can't go back. You already saw this in real life. You saw how we started with O node and then O tokens, and then we went back and then we said let's simplify it. That's engineering. That's us doing mistakes and coming back. Now, and a lot of people, someone was asking me this the other day. I said, wouldn't that be a waste of time? And I said to them, no. Now we can tell the story. When someone comes and says, why didn't you guys do it this way? Be like, well, we tried that. We actually have a YouTube video of it, and you can
Yeah.
you can
I might have something else too that would help us proceed. If we look at the contract for this service, you just have the one method with an
Mhm,
input and an output.
mhm.
We could define the purpose of it. Like, what should that outcome be for the rest of the system? Should it be all those tokens are classified
I'm
as
okay with
much as
that.
they can be until we turn them into nodes? Or are we looking to possibly modify them again later?
I'm okay with that. Of course, you're gonna have to kind of, for code that is not readable right away, you're gonna have to kind of say, I'm totally okay with that, Joe. But
Okay.
but at least does this concept make sense though? Do you see anything in here? Literal word and then separator. I even want to say, I don't want to say literal, I want to say value, but okay, literal is fine
Well, I
too.
mean, if we take just standard URL stuff, like the query string parameters are just key value pairs, so we can match that for now, and then even break them down further. Like what would the key be? That would be an identifier, a keyword, or something like that. And the value would be either a single value or um, one of these paren. Well, I guess not one of the parens, but like Bob equals Sam's or something like that would end up being one value, unless there's a separator in there. So I don't
So
know.
let's see. Mm, 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 mm.
That's basically how Sam does it. He right now in the way that OData is, he splits up the URL into the query string key value pair, where the key is either a OData parameter or whatever they call it, the select, the filter, things like that. That's the key in that case. So the value would be the select, and then he breaks them down into the tokens. So whatever that value
Yeah,
is, broken
we
down
we
at that
we
point.
might end up not building a tree at all. Do you remember when I said let's just flatten it and see how things work? We might not have to solve it as a tree. So
Yeah.
don't rely on that a lot as an assumption. But it's also likely that we might solve it as a tree, right? We'll see. But anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that,
I mean, could the results of the projection service be the thing that we spit out?
yeah, a projection service should just spit out projected tokens. We can
Right.
we can call them projections. I'm okay with that.
But I guess where I was going with that is like O nodes were designed to be a hierarchy, right? A tree. But what I'm saying is if the projection results are enough for us to then build expression trees, for example, do we need that third stage?
The projections don't know anything about OData. That's the problem.
That was
Well,
my original argument in the chat too. Is like, should they get hints about OData a little bit? Anything that would be helpful for us to move on to the next step, which could possibly be building an O node tree.
As long as, so whatever is gonna turn these tokens into OData mappable values, that's one responsibility. Whatever converts these O tokens into OData specific nodes, that's one responsibility. And you can't mush these together. Because I want to really separate them so people can go and propose their own new keywords without having to worry about the mappability of the information. What I'm
yeah.
trying to go
So
ahead.
my confusion was like there's tokenization, and then there's building the hierarchy of nodes, which is very specifically OData,
Mhm.
and then there's this step in the middle that you perceive, And my thinking was either this step in the middle needs to know OData things or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, what's it adding above and beyond what tokenization has already done?
Yep.
That's where I was kind of vague on it, because I was like, there's clearly, you've seen something, Hassan, where there are clearly 3 stages in this process, but I don't know what that second one is yet. I'm not completely clear on it.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about this for a second. If you have, so stage 0 is where you're getting the, $sign filter equal name EQ Sam. That's the raw query. Stage 1 is where all of that turns into, tokens. So this is a token that has, a word, and then here's another token that has a separator, and then you have another token, and so on and so forth. So you're breaking that into a bunch of tokens. Stage 2 is where I'm looking and saying, okay, now you have something else. Now you have an O token, right? And this O token says this is and this is the question about being agnostic and all that. I'm basically going and saying, hey, do you want this to be, actually an operation, right? And you want the next one to be an equal sign, equal, and you want the next one to be an O token of type, I don't know, name or property or whatever you want to call it, right? And then we come to the last stage where we go and say, this one here is like this. And then the last stage, stage 3, is where you get this node. So this turns into O node, right? O node of whatever you want to say, but that O node has O nodes inside of it because you're building that kind of structure to kind of make it processable and parsable.
That's what's going to get translated to the expression stuff.
Yes. So
So
stage 4 is the expressions. SQL, graph, again, back to OData, whatever you want to make. Go ahead, Joe. Sorry, go ahead.
So we actually discussed at the end of our last stream what we envision the stage 2 to be like. I believe we chose the word keyword for dev operation and so on. So this stage here will have to either be hinted. Something's going to have to hint to what these types are going to be. And that's all I'm saying is we do have a dependency here, and we haven't figured that out yet. So either another class is going to tell us, or we're hard coding, which I don't really want to do, or something's going to have to help us out here.
What do you want the dependency to tell you exactly?
Given a token or a set of tokens that match certain criteria, some operation is going to happen. So take the first token here, word, we look at it, we say, okay, yeah, it's definitely a word, but we don't want it to be a word going forward. We want it to be a keyword because we have enough information that we can make that guess. And what that'll do is allow the O node to be better classified so that the processing services don't have to do as much work. So basically it's a stepping stone. It just kind of finesses it a little bit. If you're making a pie, we've already rolled out the dough and everything. This is trimming it up into the circle and just getting it ready for the next step.
Just trying to think.
So thinking about your rule of 3, Hassan, I kind of had it in my mind that you'd have classic cul-de-sac, right?
Yeah.
Where so if we're going from left to right, the orchestration service that calls into this would call like a query parameter service, and that would call into a token service, and that would call into some sort of token type service that would resolve the types. So what that would allow us to do was the first thing in the chain would basically do a split on the ampersand on the assumption that what we're receiving is some sort of standard query string, right? So then we've got, if you like, an array of parameters. For each parameter, we call into the dependent token service to tokenize. And then whilst tokenizing, the dependent tokenization service would call into some, if you like, token type provider of sorts that
Mhm.
would say, okay, I can have my intelligence here that's OData dependent because I'm not doing tokenization directly. I'm just being asked my advice on what is the token type here. So what that would allow us to do is the tokenization service could be truly agnostic and wouldn't care. The thing that it depends on could be OData, could be something else, and could make the decision. And because it's also classic, the standard, and a cul-de-sac, you would go all the way down that chain, and the net result would be an O token array, or potentially an array of O token arrays, one for each parameter that was in the query. Then you could take that array of O token arrays and spit them into an O node service that would build out the hierarchy.
Okay, I
with me?
see. Yeah, yeah. So this service here will be protocol specific.
Sorry, the more I play with the standard, the more I start to think, right, what would Hassan do here? And I'm thinking cul-de-sacs all the way.
Let's do it this way. No, I like that. I like that a lot. So if you're basically going and saying this protocol specific, it will go tokenize, take these tokens and hand it over to something, whatever that something is, and then it will.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
think about it the other way, right? So you've got an orchestration service, okay? That sits on top of a processing service, and then that sits on top of
foundation service.
Your foundation service, right? And then at the very bottom, you've got your broker. So draw that flow out, and then underneath that, we'll create a copy of it, and we'll name them all.
Okay.
And you'll love this, because what it basically means is we can go from string to, say, an expression tree by literally just following the cul-de-sac pattern. Right? So along the top, we do, what I referred to as a query. So the orchestration service is going to be the thing that's just going to deliver the result. I don't know what that'll be. That'll just be like an expression provider or something. I don't know.
Okay.
From
let's call it orchestration for now.
Let's call it, it'll be the OData orchestration service or something. Okay. So you've got, tokenization is the bit that we've done. Now, I think along the top line there, that's the second thing in the line. The first thing in the line is a query parameter service. So top left.
Top left. This guy.
That guy, yeah. And then the third one is, if you like, the so the one that you've labeled broker on the top line. That would be your OData tokenization service or something. I don't know. We might call it something different. But basically, tokenization service will call into that and say, hey, give me a type for this token. Yeah. Whilst it's resolving.
You can't have a service calling a service.
Why not?
It's gonna have to this gonna have to either be a broker.
Sure. Okay. Call it a broker. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking rules of three, right?
Okay.
So if you think of that as a broker, that's your OData type broker or something, or token type broker or something like that. Okay. So imagine you go down all that chain. So the first thing splits the query up. The second thing breaks it down and starts working on figuring out or categorizing tokens, but it asks the third thing what the tokens should be. The net result is you get, like I said, an array of O token arrays back. So you'll get an array of O tokens for each query parameter. You then go down the second line. Now, the second line is going to be your OData, your O node service, effectively. And I think that when we get into that, we're going to break that down further for different reasons. So, for example, that may depend on, say, a filter service and a select service and a whatever else that needs, effectively. So we may have to do some magic tricks in there to start breaking that out eventually. But that may not be the case for the O node service, because I don't think we need too much intelligence in there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I haven't quite fully fleshed it all out, but I'm thinking it's classic cul-de-sac. So the first three go back up, and then the next three would provide potentially O nodes or.
Where is your entry point to this? Is it the orchestration or the broker?
The entry point would be the orchestration, right? Because presumably you tip in a request that
Yeah,
would
you
be
have an exposer on the left side that we're not
Mm.
seeing.
Then
yeah.
something sitting in here
Here's my string.
for exposure, and that's basically coming in and saying, hey, here's a value. Go down there. Go pick all the way down.
Yeah.
You know, something needs to change here, but you're basically. I'm just trying to kind of catch your idea. You're
So
basically. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry,
So
you continue.
Where I got lost was so on the second line there. Let's say that was the O node service, right?
Hmm.
So then that would depend on some kind of expression parsing service. And then the third thing would be the brokers for it. But then it would be an array of brokers because you'd have a select broker, a filter broker, an order by broker. And I didn't know if that fell into like reasonably allowed grounds under the standard. I don't think it would because you'd end up with a big array.
Yeah.
And we want to try and apply the rule of three somehow.
There's also the purity of contract, which is a huge problem that we're dealing with. Like, you know, your service shouldn't deal with multiple contracts, and now you're saying I want to send O tokens in and get from the other side nodes. That's a problem that we're gonna have to solve.
You want to into the so if you've got an O node service, you're going to give it O tokens, and you're going to get back an O node, a root O node that
I don't want
contains-
it to do that.
You don't want it to do that.
What do you want it to do?
Your service should only deal with primitive types or a single contract. I don't know how to solve this problem yet.
So an O token's not a primitive.
No,
No, we made it.
Okay,
we made it
so
up. Mhm.
okay, so once we've got arrays of O tokens, how are we going to turn those into O nodes without passing those arrays of O tokens into an O node service?
The
You
stupid
don't know?
answer is serialize it, but
You
Yeah.
don't know?
make it a string.
So ideally, what I want to do, you want to still
You
on.
could do it indirectly, but like you say, you could serialize things. But if you do that, what you're doing is you're relying on something like JSON in the middle, and that's just going to add overhead, right?
Yeah.
You want something that this could be rapidly called in amongst a whole ton of other business logic. Imagine you've got some, I don't know, business process that wants to call this 10,000 times a second to do some really complicated stuff for some reason, because we haven't envisaged how it's going to be used, right? We don't know all the possible ways it could be used. You want this to return stuff in like, milliseconds max, not like seconds. So
Optimization is not a problem for us because there is a limitation on how big a query can be. So we're fine. Don't worry about that.
Okay, so
but how do we honor this pure contract concept? This is a challenge, right? Because how do you create spaghetti code? You go and say, this guy has a model and this guy has a completely different model. And somehow these two guys know about each other's models, or one of them knows about the other because you're passing that guy in and you're trying to get something out, right? That doesn't work.
I think that's okay if they're in the same library, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we get down to the broker on the O node side of things and expression building, that will be an external dependency. So at that point, you just want to serialize it out or something, or the dependency will accept a blob of JSON, which is an O node hierarchy, right?
Right.
And then it will give you back an expression tree or something. But when you're going from like string to O node and tokenization in the middle, it's all part of the same chunk of business logic as I see it.
This is why I said we should just let these services enhance on the existing contract, take O tokens and spit out back O tokens again.
The problem with this mindset is we've already built a service that violates that. The tokenization service does.
How?
You pass it a string and you get token.
Primitive types are okay.
I mean, we could make it return a string. Just be a string of JSON, right?
Or there's a way to play around that. And the way to play, you have to understand the rules that restrict this. Make sure that your code is simple at all times.
Or something.
What did you say, Joe?
You have to provide like a ticket or something. Like, hey, you do this, and I get my ID. I can check back later.
I have a solution, but I really need to know what you guys have. And the solution is not as hard as you think. Like my initial solution is to keep the same contract across the board, which is allowed if you're going to stick to the same contract.
Then we create a protocol. So tokens are two-part identifiers, nodes are two-part identifiers. So you basically have a stream, and then you use string reading effectively on that stream.
You're assuming that it's a one-to-one match.
Well, it would be, but all you're doing is you're looking for a separator within your stream, right? And when you find a separator, that tells the next thing in line. But they would have to agree on what the separator is in the stream.
Would you both please give it a thought until Wednesday? I would greatly appreciate it because okay, let's roll back. Do you understand why this rule is important? That's how people create garbage code, is when your processing service knows about two contracts at the same time, something called contract purity. You can work with primitive types, and you can work with one single external contract. Underneath, you could be working with other contracts. That's okay. But at the outside, you can't input one thing and get out something else except if one of them is primitive. Challenge that rule in the standard and prove me wrong. And let's talk about it in Wednesday, okay? I have to run. We're good? All right. Thank you both. I'll talk to you later. Take care.